what do you see as the challenges of meetings today, especially in this hybrid work environment that we have?
Yeah, so hybrid's changed a lot, right? And so I think the first thing that hybrid changed is that when we all used to be in an office, one of the things that was true was there was an actual physical limit on the number of meetings that you could have. There's only so many meeting rooms in the company, right? And so if all the meetings rooms were booked, you couldn't really have that meeting. And so there was an actual physical limit. And so when we went hybrid and remote, that limit was gone, right? You could have as many meetings as you wanted. It was easier than ever to create a meeting on other people's calendars. All of a sudden, everybody was empowered with this super powerful ability to usurp time from each other without even, thinking about it. And so that was the first thing that changed. The other thing that changed is that it really changed the way that people come into meetings, right? Especially if we're talking about hybrid meetings, as an example, where some people are virtual and then you have a bunch of people clamored into one conference room, and it's just not an equal footing, right? So if you're on the virtual side, it's really hard for you to elbow your way into the conversation, right? It's really hard for you to basically understand any side conversations that might be happening. On the flip side, if you're in the room, that has its own distinct set of challenges too. So for example, one of the things that we do at Fellow and we encourage is this only being part of meetings that you're going to have a significant portion, call it like 5% or more of the meeting to comment on or to actually speak. You're not going to speak 5% of the meeting. You shouldn't be in that meeting. And in a virtual setting, that's easier, right? You could come in, you could have the part of the conversation, you could go. In a physical meeting, it's really awkward to stand up in the middle and leave, and it doesn't happen as often. So there actually are disadvantages if you're doing the physical stuff too. But I think the biggest benefit, to be honest, from the virtual and hybrid stuff is you can actually have a meeting assistant present, right? That can add value in ways that wasn't possible before. It's almost getting to the point that you wouldn't really want to have a meeting in person unless you also
I
had
was going to
the
say,
presence
have
of a.
Google or Zoom or something going on with your meeting software to be able to, or your AI meeting assistant, be able to take notes. Because you're right, like who's taking notes?
Yeah,
I
and
mean, I take
and it depends, right? If you and I are getting to know each other and want to grab a coffee and rapport, if we're doing a project meeting, it's actually better in a virtual setting. Like you actually get more out of it. It is a suboptimal experience not to do it that way.
So, how do you suppose companies can make meetings more productive these days? If we continue along this line of thought.
Yeah, so there's a lot of so there's a lot that can be done in terms of making meetings everywhere productive, and a lot of this maybe you'll start to think about in terms of internal meetings, but applies equally to external meetings with customers. So on the first thing is that every meeting should actually have a shared collaborative agenda. If there is no shared collaborative agenda, then not everybody's on the same page of what needs to be discussed. If you have great things like a shared collaborative agenda, and if they are shared with everyone, say 24 hours in advance, then all sorts of magical things can happen, right? So you can see what the discussion is about. So you may say that this particular meeting, I don't need to be there. I can
Yeah.
read the fellow summary afterwards, right? Because fellow is going to be there. It's going to summarize things. I can just step out, right? And then just get the gist, because it looks like based on this agenda, I'm not an active participant, so therefore I don't actually need to be there. The other thing is that, again, just this notion of if you're not going to speak for more than 5% of the meeting, you shouldn't be there. Meetings shouldn't have more than 8 people. If there are more than 8 people in a meeting, that it just suggests a structural problem. There's this great study that the more the number of attendees that you have past the number of 8, the ability to make a decision decreases. And I think when you hit 15 or 16 participants, the ability to make a decision approaches 0. So it is, again, inversely correlated with the number of
It's less of a
participants that you
meeting
have.
at that point, more of a presentation if you have 15 or 16 people there versus an actual meeting.
Exactly. And when I think about hybrid and remote work, one of the biggest advantages of this type of working is that you can chunk and use your hours in the most productive way, right? So if in the morning, say between 10 and noon, you are the most productive you, that might not be the time that you're going to want to participate in a meeting where you're not going to do much of the talking anyway, right? So maybe that's a fellow was in the meeting, you read the summary, or you maybe watch a portion of the meeting. You're going to do that at 4 p.m. or 5 p.m. when you're like super tired and you've already had your productive hours. You're not going to put your most productive hours to consume that kind of content. So it takes this idea where a meeting has to be synchronous when everybody's in person, and it makes it possible for you to have meetings in this asynchronous format. The other thing is that it also allows you to continue conversations after the fact. So sometimes a meeting will happen, but you might want to tag in people that were not there. And you could do that. Maybe you're collaboratively commenting on the content of the meeting that was produced afterwards. Maybe you have follow-up questions. And so the conversation can also continue. So there's a lot that the second that you make a meeting hybrid or remote, there's a lot that can happen in a much better way. But all of these things at the end of the day help with this idea of having a productive meeting. The final thing that I'll say about this is that other than certain meetings that are, call it routine that you really should have all the time, call it like a one-on-one meeting or a business review, most meetings should always have an end date. So if you have a recurring meeting and you don't have an end date for that recurring meeting, it is actually irresponsible. And the reason is that humans are habitual creatures. And when something is a habit and you are having it week on week, even though the original purpose of the meeting was something else, you will still continue that because other purposes have built in, but they had nothing to do with the original purpose. One way to get around this is this idea of just having that end date in place. You can also do other things like cancel meetings, all recurring meetings once a year. One of our customers, Shopify, does this, for example. And so there are other ways and approaches to it. But yeah, those are some good tips to get people started.
Wow. I mean, I feel like you just gave like 10 great tips that we just need to organize into 10 things you should know about meetings. And I think you also dispelled the myth about this hybrid work environment where, versus in person. I remember it wasn't not too long ago that we were in person, to your point.